Hi, my name is Kiana Boudreau, and this presentation is centered around critical multimodal discourse analysis, what it is, and what its theoretical frames are. Before we delve into the presentation on critical multimodal discourse analysis, I would like to briefly introduce myself. As I just said, my name is Kiana, and I'm a student at Concordia in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. My research focuses on the expression of sexuality on social media, so concepts such as multimodality and discursive analysis are central to the research that I do. So now that we're done with introductions, we can get into it. As you would have gathered from the titular slide, I'm going to be discussing the methodology known as critical multimodal discourse analysis. Now, I know that that's quite a mouthful and doesn't just roll off the tongue in the way that I'd like, so I'm going to be referring to the method as CMDA throughout the rest of this presentation. Also, the following presentation will be split into two major sections. First is a general overview of what the method does. This includes information such as which fields it has been adopted by and what kinds of communication the method can be applied to. The second section involves a dive into the theoretical background of CMDA. I like to affectionately call this methodology a Russian nesting doll because, as you will see, there are various approaches which are nested into two subcategories of discourse studies, which ultimately combine to create CMDA. So, critical multimodal discourse analysis. What the heck is it? So, first and foremost, we need to know what CMDA even is. Well, unfortunately, there's no concrete definition, but here's one that I've created through an amalgamation of a lot of other definitions that I've come across in my research. CMDA can be understood as a tool for analysis which focuses on the ways in which combinations of semiotic forms, such as photos or text, create meaning, and how these discourses are disseminated, legitimized, and naturalized through semiotic forms. So, what does it study? Well, CMDA focuses its attention on multimodal forms of communication. This simply means that it looks at forms of communication which use more than one method to convey an idea. For an example, a magazine cover makes use of carefully selected texts, fonts, and colors combined with a perfectly curated cover shot in order to convey the meanings embodied by the magazine itself. While more intentional visual design is oftentimes more studied using this methodology, it can also be applied to personal photos. When we're looking at these multimodal forms, what is it that we're looking for within CMDA? Well, we look for color, which colors are being used, what emotions they invoke, the saturation, things of this nature, the iconography within the visual representation, modality, or how real the photo feels or genuine, the typography, such as fonts, colors, size of typography, which social actors are being represented, and the visual syntax / photo composition of a multimodal form. While CMDA has a large pool of materials to choose from, it's equally as diverse in terms of which fields utilize the methodology. It started in the field of linguistics and visual arts, which we'll get into more later, but it's now used in a number of fields, such as semiotics, applied linguistics, media and communication studies, education, cultural studies, and many others. Before we get into the theoretical background / history of the methodology, I would first like to point out a few things to keep in mind when applying CMDA to your own research. First, this methodology focuses a lot on depth. This means that the dissection of the object of study can be extremely time-consuming and will most likely result in a huge amount of data collected. The upside to this being that it provides a mass of insight into the meanings that are being created, disseminated, and naturalized within the object. It's for this reason that I suggest keeping the units of analysis rather small and trying not to analyze too many things. Moreover, because of its focus on depth, it is often a good idea to combine this method with something broader. For instance, in my own research, I'm using CMDA to take a look into specific posts on Instagram and the meanings that they convey, while also utilizing a thematic analysis of certain hashtag feeds in order to get a feel for the broader context and trends. So let's get into the theoretical background. How did we get to CMDA? The theoretical background for CMDA comes from two distinct yet very complementary fields within the umbrella of discourse studies: critical discourse analysis, which will be referred to as CDA, and multimodal discourse analysis, which will be referred to as MDA. Thus, critical multimodal discourse analysis. Very original, I know. It's also important to note that CMDA is a fairly young methodology, as it started appearing in the academic realm sometime in the 1990s. However, due to the massive impact that the evolution of the internet has had on human communication, it has become a highly relevant and important way to understand the discourse is presented in our increasingly textually and visually multimodal world. Both subcategories of discourse studies presented here sound pretty much the same, but they're actually very distinct from one another. Here are a few of the notable differences between CDA and MDA. Firstly, their goals are entirely different. On the one hand, CDA is concerned with unveiling the relationship between language and power in day-to-day texts, whereas multimodal discourse analysis, or MDA, aims to explore the various meaning-making potentials that are created through the combination of different semiotic modes, and places a lot of importance on the socio-cultural context in which the object exists. Further, while CDA grew out of theory present in critical linguistics, MDA grew out of the visual arts who wanted to apply CDA to art and non-textual forms of communication. Therefore, MDA evolved from CDA. In order to better understand the differences between CDA and MDA, we need to look more closely at both. But we're going to start with CDA. One of the main facets of critical discourse analysis is the notion of problem solving. This is integral to the work being done using CDA, as it focuses so heavily on the relationship between languages and power, as I just mentioned. Thus, choosing a problematic as a starting point enables the research to find strong analyses. In this same vein, CDA has the ultimate goal of social change due once again to its emphasis on problem solving. It does this through utilizing either a positive or a negative critique. A positive critique is generally understood as the ways in which individuals mitigate social wrongs and put additional emphasis on the identifications of ways to right said wrongs in the future. Simply put, the positive critique aims to positively impact the social world. In contrast, a negative critique involves observing how society produces and reinforces social inequalities. Therefore, it aims to look at the negative aspects of social life. Finally, critical discourse analysis has three main approaches, which are, just like everything else in CMDA, distinct yet interrelated. The three approaches to CDA include the dialectical relational, the discourse historical, and the socio-cognitive. The dialectical relational approach places strong focus on neo-capitalism and the discourses produced in the knowledge-based economies of the post-modern society. Not only does it look at the internal logic and operations of a particular discourse, it also looks at the relationships that exist across hegemonic discourses. Further, it places a lot of importance on the context in which said discourses are produced in order to better contextualize them. With the help of Halliday's systemic functional linguistics, which is very briefly put, posits that language is only one of many ways to create meaning. This approach clearly demonstrates the interdependence of discursive and material structures. The discourse historical approach was heavily influenced by the Frankfurt School of social thought. It places the most importance on the immediate context in which the text is produced, as well as the larger socio-historical contexts that surround the text. This approach is the one that focuses most heavily on the production and reproduction of social injustice. It also relies heavily on a few interconnected elements, such as strong empirical bases, interdisciplinarity, and the implementation of a variety of other methodologies as well. The sociocognitive approach argues that the discursive structures cannot be directly related to the social structure, but are rather connected through the mental processes and language use of the individual actor. It is based on the cognitive social theory, which argues that individuals are agential social actors in their lives and do not merely take a passive role in their existence. Thus, it provides more agency than typical discursive studies. By integrating all three of these approaches, the critical part of analyses using CMDA become much more robust and provide the researcher with a well-contextualized and well-rounded understanding of the object of inquiry. Now that we've covered all of the approaches to CDA, let's move on to its counterpart, multimodal discourse analysis, or MDA. Like CDA, MDA places a lot of emphasis on understanding the history and context of unique combinations of semiotic forms in order to map the ways in which they produce meaning. This emphasis is most likely due to the fact that MDA, as I mentioned earlier, evolved out of CDA. Thus, the core tenets can be found in both categories of these discourse studies. MDA was also originally used in fields such as linguistics and visual arts, as it considers multimodal semiotic forms as having a distinctive grammar created through the combination of forms rather than static elements, which each have a rigid meaning. Again, there are two distinct approaches to multimodal discourse analysis. These approaches include the social semiotic and the interactional. The social semiotic approach understands language as one of many semiotic systems which create meaning within a culture. Influenced by Halliday's theory of language as a social semiotic, language in this approach can be interpreted in reference to its location in the social world and is influenced by the idea that there is a relationship that exists between text/discourse and the larger social context. Thus, a text is understood as any exchange of meanings in the social world, which serves the following three functions. Ideational, which deals with the representing patterns of experience and logical relations between them. The interpersonal, which conveys emotions and attitudes while enacting social relationships. And the textual, which deals with interweaving ideational and interpersonal meanings into a cohesive and coherent semantic unit, or a text. The linguistic resources that allow for the combination of all three functions are called systems networks. Here we can see a map of CDA and MDA within CMDA. At the bottom, we can see the different approaches. In the middle, we have CDA and MDA, which ultimately combine into CMDA. To summarize, critical multimodal discourse analysis is extremely interdisciplinary and has a very wide range of objects of study. It has a particular focus on depth and not breadth. It looks at the combination of semiotic forms and how they disseminate, legitimize, and naturalize discourses through their meaning-making potential, and can be used on basically any form of multimodal communication. Thank you so much for watching my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something new about critical multimodal discourse analysis.